Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little smokier. A time of sagas, saggy straw mattresses and sheep that snored louder than their owners. Forget the Hollywood image of gleaming Viking halls filled with feasts and songs. The reality was closer to a smoke-filled barn where your lungs were the fireplace filter, and bedtime meant battling lice until dawn. So before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you're into these sleepy journeys through the less glamorous parts of history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 875 inside a Viking Longhouse. The good news, you've survived another freezing Scandinavian night. The bad news, you're coughing up half the smoke that's been trapped in here since yesterday. Your bed is nothing more than a pile of straw stuffed into a wooden frame, except the straw is crawling with fleas that treat your skin like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Your blanket is a greasy wool pelt that hasn't been washed since last winter and now smells like goat, smoke, and something you hope isn't fish stew. There are no pillows, just the soft comfort of a bundled tunic that feels like sleeping on a bag of frozen turnips. You blink against the haze because the longhouse has no chimney. The fire in the centre has been burning all night, filling the air with a thick cloud of soot that clings to the beams, your hair, and your lungs. Viking rafters were found blackened with centuries of smoke, and so were people's lungs. You're not dreaming of Valhalla, you're praying you don't choke before breakfast. And speaking of breakfast, you're not eating alone. Because here in the Longhouse, privacy didn't exist. Families, servants, and even livestock slept side by side. Chickens wander between bodies, goats shift restlessly at your feet, and you swear someone's cow is breathing down your neck. The combined smell of humans, animals, sweat, and smoke is thick enough to chew. This wasn't a mistake. Vikings kept animals indoors for warmth, because winters were brutal. But that meant you were constantly sharing space with droppings, vermin, and the lovely orchestra of bleats, coughs, and snores. Archaeologists have found Viking skeletons with evidence of parasite-related anemia. In other words, the fleas weren't just annoying, they were slowly draining you dry. And then there's the noise. Forget the peaceful hush of a snowy Nordic night. You've got the crackle of fire, the squeal of pigs, the chatter of restless children, and the coughs of adults hacking up half a lung. Trying to fall asleep was like trying to nap inside a crowded smokehouse. The sagas may brag about warrior strength, but the real feat was surviving bedtime. You stretch, but immediately regret it. The air is cold near the floor, the smoke burns your throat and your knees ache from lying on a straw that's somehow both damp and scratchy. You are itchy, wheezy, and definitely not rested. Viking life wasn't about glory on the battlefield. It was about enduring the nightly misery of your own house. But if you think sleep was the worst part, wait until you see what they ate in here. Because surviving a Viking meal was its own kind of endurance test. You barely managed to sit upright in the haze, scratching at your skin where fleas have made a home. Your lungs still sting from the smoke and your eyes water like you've just cut a sack of onions. But there is no time to recover. The longhouse is stirring, and that means food is being prepared. If you thought trying to sleep in here was bad, now you are about to eat in the exact same conditions. A Viking longhouse doubled as kitchen, bedroom, barn, and banquet hall. Everything happened under the same blackened beams, and that central fire you coughed through all night is now being used to cook breakfast. The scent is strong, but not in the way you would hope. It is equal parts charred wood, stewing meat, and the faint aroma of goat droppings that someone definitely did not clean up. You suddenly realise that every bite of food you eat has been kissed by the same smoke that coated your lungs. Forget hickory smoked flavour, this was lung disease smoked flavour. What did Vikings actually eat here? Grains were the foundation, mostly barley, rye and oats. These were boiled into thick porridge or baked into dense flatbreads. Archaeological finds of Viking bread show that they were so gritty from stone ground flour that chewing them was like biting into edible sandpaper. You would need strong teeth, and if you did not have them, Well, you swallowed carefully and hoped you would not chip what little enamel you had left. Meat was on the table too, but it was never as glamorous as sagas suggest. Sure, pigs and cattle were slaughtered for feasts, but on ordinary days the meat was smoked, salted or dried, and often tasted like the barn it came from. Preservation was necessary for survival through long winters, but it also meant your dinner chewed more like leather straps than tender steak. Fish was common, especially herring, which was salted so heavily that one Viking skeleton excavated in Denmark showed signs of kidney strain, likely from a lifetime of brine-heavy meals. You wanted protein, but your body got sodium overload. Milk was another staple, and from it came butter and cheese. But Viking butter was not a neat golden slab you would find at the supermarket. It was often stored underground in wooden tubs, buried in bogs to keep it cool. Yes, bog butter was a real thing, and lumps of it have actually been dug up centuries later, still intact and still technically edible. Imagine digging your dinner out of swamp mud before spreading it on bread that grinds your teeth down. Fine dining was not part of this world. As you choke down a bite of bread and salted fish, your mind wanders to the sheer logistics of cooking in this longhouse. There was no chimney, which meant the fire smoked up the room endlessly. But that smoke was not entirely useless. It doubled as a preservative, coating meat hung in the rafters and helping to dry it for storage. So yes, while you were coughing yourself half to death, your food was technically being seasoned. Nothing says dinner time like meat that has been marinating in a cloud of carcinogens for weeks. Alcohol helped take the edge off, and mead was common. Made from fermented honey, water and herbs, it was the Viking equivalent of beer, although it was often weaker than the heroic drink described in poems. You could drink enough to dull the discomfort of fleas, smoke and salted fish, but then you had to stumble back to your straw bedding and hope you would not vomit on your neighbours. Drinking too much in this environment could easily become a public health hazard, and sagas record plenty of feasts that ended in brawls, vomit or worse. Your stomach growls, but not in excitement. A Viking diet was high in calories but not always balanced. Malnutrition was common, especially in harsh winters when preserved food was all that remained. Archaeologists studying Viking teeth have found grooves and wear that suggest people chewed on gritty bread and hard-dried fish for most of their lives. Some skulls even show evidence of jaw strain from decades of gnawing. Imagine your dentist telling you that your molars cracked from eating too many rye loaves baked with pebbles still in the flour. The setting only makes things worse. You eat while smoke stings your eyes, animals shuffle nearby, and children whine for food. The fire crackles, the hall buzzes with noise, and someone sneezes without even bothering to cover their mouth. You're not dining in a noble hall of heroes. You're sharing a cramped, itchy barn with a few dozen people, every cough and sniffle echoing off the smoke-darkened beams. If one person had a cold, everyone else got it by dessert. Food was so important to Viking life that sagas often describe banquets as moments of glory. Yet the archaeology suggests a far grimmer picture. Worm eggs have been found in soil samples from Viking latrines, meaning parasites were almost guaranteed. Those gritty loaves and salted meats were not just tough to chew, they also carried the risk of intestinal worms, which thrived in unsanitary conditions. You could eat like a warrior but digest like a battlefield, and there is no escaping the absurdity of it all. Here you are, imagining Viking life as proud, fierce and noble. But in truth you are gnawing on dried fish so salty it could pickle your insides, coughing through the smoke of your own dinner, and scratching fleas between every bite. Romance of the sagas aside, the real Viking feast was less banquet and more endurance trial. You sit back feeling both full and queasy, the way you might after eating gas station sushi. The fire still smoulders, smoke curls around the rafters, and the livestock shift uncomfortably at your feet. You wonder if anyone in history ever described this life as enjoyable without a heavy dose of alcohol. Your stomach aches, your lungs burn, and you begin to see why sagas focused on battle. Compared to surviving dinner, battle might have been the easier option. And as the longhouse settles again, you realise that the night was never just about sleep or food. It was about enduring the environment itself, a constant battle against smoke, pests and hunger. But before you even think about resting again, you have to deal with the other unavoidable reality of longhouse living. Where all that food went after digestion was a nightmare in its own right. Your stomach twists as the salted herring and bog butter settle uneasily, and nature begins to call. The problem is that inside a Viking longhouse, there is no polite way to answer. The same room that serves as dining hall, bedroom and barn also has to deal with the aftermath of digestion. And without modern plumbing, the results were as predictable as they were unpleasant. Archaeological digs in Scandinavia have revealed that many longhouses had no dedicated toilet facilities at all. Waste was often tossed into pits near the building, or simply carried outside and left to soak into the soil. Soil samples from Viking settlements in Denmark and Greenland are riddled with parasite eggs, a grim reminder that what left your body rarely stayed gone. Roundworm, whipworm and tapeworm all flourished in these communities, which meant that even if you survived on porridge and salted fish, you were probably feeding a family of intestinal hitchhikers at the same time. Imagine trying to sleep while the air inside your home carried the faint, ever-present aroma of waste seeping in from outside pits. Combine that with the smoke, sweat, and animals, and you were living in what amounted to an open sewer with wooden walls. Latrines existed in some larger settlements, but they were communal, often little more than wooden planks laid across a hole. Privacy did not exist, and the smell made sure everyone knew when you were there. Modern bathroom breaks may feel inconvenient, but they are paradise compared to crouching over a frozen pit, while your neighbours cheerfully continued with their chores nearby. The problem was not just discomfort. Sanitation directly shaped Viking health. Worm infestations contributed to chronic malnutrition, which weakened immune systems already stressed by smoke inhalation and poor diets. A study of Viking coprolites, or fossilised feces, revealed massive amounts of parasite remains, some so large that the researchers joked they could practically reconstruct the Viking menu from them. Not only could you see what people ate, you could also see the thriving worm colonies that followed. The sagas may celebrate strong warriors, but the evidence shows those warriors were often fighting battles on two fronts, one on the battlefield and another in their own intestines. You try to imagine a long winter night in this environment. The fire smoulders, the air thickens, and the only way to relieve yourself is to step outside into freezing winds with a bucket. If you did not freeze, you slipped on ice or trampled into a pile of waste that had been hastily tossed aside. Some families kept chamber pots indoors, but those had to be emptied each morning, often thrown directly onto middens or street surfaces. The result was that settlements themselves often reeked, with drainage channels running waste through the streets like grimy tributaries. And unlike modern sewers, these channels were breeding grounds for bacteria and pests. It is worth remembering that Vikings prized cleanliness compared to many of their European contemporaries. Combs, tweezers, and even small ear spoons have been found in graves, suggesting grooming mattered. But no amount of combing your hair could erase the reality that sanitation infrastructure was primitive at best. You could look neat while still being riddled with parasites, much like polishing the outside of a bucket without worrying about what sloshed inside. Cleanliness was relative, and in the longhouse it often meant looking tidy while still smelling like the midden heap behind your home. The absurdity is that waste was also useful. Manure from livestock was collected and mixed into building materials. Walls of turf and dung could insulate longhouses during harsh winters. It worked, but it also meant that the very walls around you sometimes contained the same waste you had tried to get rid of. Imagine dozing off against a wall, unaware that it was partly constructed with yesterday's byproducts of your cow. The line between house and latrine blurred in ways that make modern composting toilets look luxurious. The impact on daily life was enormous. Children grew up exposed to parasites and bacteria from birth, meaning survival depended on building resilience early. Adults carried constant low-level infections, sapping energy that was otherwise needed for farming, raiding, or simply enduring the winter. Feasts and gatherings might sound glorious, but the archaeological evidence makes it clear that food, waste, and illness were all part of the same cycle. You ate salted fish, you relieved yourself into a pit, and that pit seeped into the soil that grew the next crop of barley. It was an ecosystem of discomfort, endlessly recycling misery. You stretch your legs on the straw and realise that relief was never as simple as it should be. Whether crouching over a communal pit, fumbling with a bucket in the dark, or contributing unknowingly to the parasite population of your neighbours, sanitation was a nightmare in Viking life. The Longhouse might have been warm, but it was also an incubator for disease, and every night you lay there, half asleep, half itching, and half choking, you were also breathing in the consequences of a world without plumbing. The next time you hear the word Longhouse, you might picture a noble hall filled with laughter and feasting. But in reality, you should picture a crowded barn where waste disposal was just another battle to fight before bed. And once you survived that indignity, you had to contend with something equally relentless. The constant noise of the Longhouse itself, where silence never existed and sleep was always interrupted by the chaos of communal living. You lie back down on the straw wishing for silence, but silence is a luxury the Viking Longhouse never provided. From the moment the fire smouldered in the centre to the last cough before dawn, the Longhouse was an unrelenting orchestra of sound. There was no moment of calm, no quiet night to drift off in peace, only the constant chorus of humans, animals and flames competing for dominance. The first thing you hear is the fire itself. Open hearths were never subtle. Wood cracked, sparks hissed, and logs collapsed inward with heavy thuds that jolted you awake at random intervals. There was no controlled fireplace with a tidy grate. The flames burned unevenly, sending out bursts of light and sound that reminded you constantly that your home was made of timber and thatched roof, one bad ember away from turning the entire hall into a bonfire. People dozed lightly not out of choice but out of survival instinct, their ears tuned for the unmistakable roar of fire catching where it should not. Then there were the humans. Families, servants and guests all packed together meant a never-ending cacophony of coughs, snores and muttered words. Studies of Viking skeletons show high levels of respiratory damage, meaning chronic coughing must have been a nightly soundtrack. Imagine trying to sleep while 3 people snored, 2 children cried, and a neighbour hacked so violently you wondered if his lungs might actually land in your lap. There were no earplugs, no private rooms, and no mercy. And this was before you factored in the livestock. Sheep bleated restlessly, goats stamped their hooves, pigs grunted, and chickens fluttered overhead in the rafters, where they sometimes perched for warmth. Animals were not guests in the Viking Longhouse. They were essential. They provided heat, milk, and meat. And in return they gave you a nightly reminder that barn life never truly stayed outside. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence confirm that livestock were often sheltered indoors during harsh winters. That warmth came at the cost of an animal choir rehearsing on your bedroom floor. Noise was not just about irritation, it shaped daily rhythms. Without clocks, people relied on sound to gauge the passage of time. The crackling of the fire meant it was still going. The rooster crowing told you morning had come, whether you'd slept or not. Church bells did not exist in early Viking settlements, so animals and voices became the markers of your day. The idea of a peaceful morning alarm was laughable. You were waking up to the squeal of pigs or the bark of a dog and you were grateful for it, because it meant you had survived another smoky night. Feasts amplified everything. The sagas loved to describe drinking halls alive with laughter, music and poetry, but in reality these events often turned the Longhouse into a deafening chamber. Skalds recited verses loudly enough to compete with clattering mugs, while drunken voices rose into shouting contests. Archaeological finds of musical instruments like bone flutes and lyres show that music played a role. But imagine those fragile tunes drowned out by the roar of 30 warriors arguing about who deserved the last piece of mutton. Sleep during a feast was impossible, and even after it ended, the echoes of revelry lingered in snores, groans, and the occasional argument that carried on well past dawn. Even ordinary meals produced their own clamour. Bowls clattered, wooden spoons scraped, and people shouted across the smoky room to be heard. There was no such thing as polite table manners. If you wanted food, you spoke up or you went hungry. Anthropologists studying communal dining practices note that noise levels in pre-modern households were significantly higher than what most modern people tolerate. Your ears would ring not from machines or traffic, but from the sheer press of human voices in enclosed wooden spaces. Noise pollution in the Viking Age was not an inconvenience, it was a constant stressor. Imagine trying to heal from illness or injury in an environment where peace never arrived. Viking medicine was primitive, relying on herbs, charms, and superstition. But even if you managed to find a moment of rest, the next cough, animal squeal, or collapsing log reminded you that rest was temporary. Health was not only assaulted by parasites and poor diet, but also by the lack of uninterrupted sleep. Modern science shows how critical deep sleep is for immune function. For Vikings, deep sleep was about as rare as silver coins. Even construction itself contributed to the noise. Longhouses creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. Wooden beams shifted, straw rustled, and the thatched roof occasionally let in dripping water that pattered onto the floor. You were never unaware of the house around you. It spoke constantly, a reminder that your shelter was alive with a movement and never truly sealed. And then there were the smells tied to those sounds. The grunt of a pig was followed by the unmistakable stench of what it had just dropped onto the floor. The cough of a neighbour carried the sharp tang of smoke and sickness. The creak of the rafters sometimes coincided with a chicken fluttering down, scattering feathers into your hair. Sound and scent worked together to remind you that comfort was an illusion. You shift uncomfortably, realizing that no matter where you turned, someone or something was making noise. Sleeping in a Viking longhouse was not about rest. It was about adjusting to chaos, training yourself to function in a perpetual storm of sound. Warriors may have sailed across the seas, but their endurance began here, in the nightly struggle to find rest where none could truly exist. And if the unending racket wore down your patience, the cold would test what little remained. Because the longhouse was not only smoky, noisy, and crowded, it was also freezing, and surviving the chill was a torment of its own. Your ears are still ringing from the racket of the longhouse when you notice something worse than the noise. The air pressing against your skin feels icy, even though a fire smoulders in the centre of the hall. Somehow the longhouse manages to be both smoky and freezing at the same time, as if it has mastered the art of making you uncomfortable from every angle. Viking winters were brutal, with temperatures in Scandinavia dropping low enough to turn farmland into ice for months. Longhouses were supposed to provide protection, but the truth is they were little more than glorified wooden shells. They were long, narrow buildings with walls made of timber, wattle, or turf stacked together. Insulation was minimal. Gaps between planks let cold air whistle through, and the thatched roof leaked snowmelt or rain directly onto your straw bedding. Even with a central fire burning day and night, the heat never spread evenly. You roasted if you sat near the hearth, but froze if you slept along the outer walls. Archaeologists studying reconstructed longhouses have noted temperature differences so extreme that people could be sweating in one part of the hall while shivering in another. You pull the greasy wool blanket tighter, but it barely helps. Viking textiles were sturdy but itchy, spun from sheep's wool that trapped warmth along with every smell it had ever absorbed. Washing blankets was rare, which meant you were wrapping yourself in a mixture of warmth, lanolin, and the accumulated sweat of previous seasons. It kept the cold out, but it also made your bed feel like a damp animal pelt. The floors added their own misery. Most longhouses had simple earthen floors, sometimes packed with clay, sometimes covered with straw. In winter, these floors became frozen solid, radiating cold upward through every layer of bedding. When archaeologists have studied preserved farmhouses in Iceland and Norway, they found evidence of frost penetrating directly into living spaces. That meant your feet never truly warmed, and you often woke with stiff, aching joints. You were not just sleeping poorly, you were slowly turning into a block of human ice wrapped in wool. The absurdity was that the fire meant to heat the house was also the source of constant drafts. With no chimney, smoke collected under the roof, and the only way to vent it was through small openings in the gables or doors. But those same openings invited in freezing winds. You had to choose between choking in smoke or freezing in fresh air, a nightly gamble that guaranteed you never won. Archaeologists examining soot layers in longhouses have confirmed that smoke filled the interior for centuries, which means people consistently chose breathing poison over freezing outright. That is not comfort. That is survival by choosing which slow death you preferred. Even the livestock meant to help keep the house warm contributed little. Yes, a few goats and cows added body heat, but they also trampled straw, knocked over containers, and produced their own steaming piles of cold weather decorations. The smell worsened, the noise grew, and the extra heat was barely noticeable compared to the drafts sneaking in through the walls. It was like inviting someone to sit on your bed for warmth, only to realise they had terrible gas and were stealing half your blanket. Clothing offered another layer of protection, but it came with its own problems. Vikings wore layered woolen tunics, cloaks, and trousers, often lined with fur. These helped retain heat, but sleeping in your clothes meant sweating into them and never truly drying them out. Modern fabrics wick moisture away. Wool and fur trapped it. Once wet, your clothing turned into a clammy weight that froze stiff by morning. Archaeological finds of preserved Viking garments show evidence of heavy wear, patching, and damp damage, confirming that people spent winters in half-frozen layers that never came clean. Cold seeped into the body in subtle ways. Bones recovered from Viking graves often show signs of arthritis and joint stress, conditions worsened by exposure to damp, cold environments. Living in a longhouse was not just uncomfortable, it wore people down physically, aging joints before their time. Imagine being in your 20s and already moving like a stiff elder, not from battle, but from sleeping beside a leaking wall with ice creeping into your straw mattress. You try shifting closer to the fire, but the smoke makes your eyes burn. You shuffle back toward the wall, and the cold slices through your blanket. No matter where you move, there is no perfect place. That was the reality of Viking nights. The architecture was designed to keep out predators and storms, but it never kept out the cold. People survived by huddling together, layering clothes, and hoping the fire would not die before dawn. Restful sleep was a fantasy. Every night was another test of endurance, a reminder that you were living on the edge of human tolerance. What is most surprising is how normalized it all became. Sagas describe nights by the fire, people talking, drinking, and dozing under furs as if it were cozy. But archaeology paints a harsher picture. Longhouse reconstructions have demonstrated just how smoky, drafty, and unevenly heated these spaces were. The romance of the Viking hearth was more about necessity than comfort. You stayed inside not because it was pleasant, but because stepping outside into sub-zero winds could kill you faster. Your bones ache, your teeth chatter, and your lungs sting. The sound of snoring blends with the howl of wind slipping through the rafters. This is what survival looked like in the north. Not a hall of glory, but a barn where warmth was patchy, air was poisonous, and every night reminded you that nature was always winning. And even if you endured the smoke, the noise, the waste, and the cold, there was still another enemy waiting inside those walls. The infestation of vermin that thrived in the straw, the rafters, and even your bedding made sure your nights were never truly your own. You shift on your straw bedding, hoping to find a spot less damp and less cold, but immediately you feel it. The crawling itch that never leaves you. Tiny legs moving across your skin, a bite at your ankle, another at your wrist. The true masters of the Viking Longhouse were not warriors or chieftains. They were the vermin that thrived in every corner, rafter, and bedding pile. Fleas were everywhere. Straw bedding provided the perfect habitat, warm, damp, and constantly replenished. Archaeologists have recovered flea remains from Viking layers in York, Dublin, and across Scandinavia, proving infestations were not occasional accidents but a permanent part of daily life. These insects lived not just in beds, but in the seams of clothing and the thick mats of fur blankets. Every time you lay down, you were essentially volunteering as the midnight buffet. Head lice were just as relentless. Viking combs, which have been found in graves and settlements, show wear patterns consistent with constant nitpicking. In fact, some combs even preserve tiny lice bodies wedged between their teeth, fossilized reminders that grooming was more about damage control than vanity. Combing your hair did not eliminate lice, it just shifted the odds of survival slightly in your favour. Imagine sitting by the smoky fire every night scratching furiously while your neighbour did the same. It was less community bonding and more synchronised itching. Rats added another layer of misery. They were drawn to stored grain and salted meat, scampering through rafters and gnawing holes in bags and barrels. In a world without pest control, rats were not occasional nuisances but permanent house guests. Archaeological digs at Viking trading centres like Hedeby have revealed rat bones in abundance, proof that these rodents flourished in bustling, grain-rich environments. Your longhouse was their supermarket, and your straw bed their nesting ground. The scratching sound above you in the rafters at night was not just chicken shifting. It was rats running overhead, dropping unwanted surprises into your sleeping space. Parasites were so common that they left traces in Viking skeletons. Studies of Norse remains in Greenland revealed signs of chronic anemia, likely linked to blood loss from flea infestations. Worms passed through unwashed hands and contaminated soil, leaving people malnourished despite eating calorie-heavy diets. The sagas may describe warriors with iron wills, but the reality was many of those warriors spent their nights scratching sores, coughing through smoke and battling parasites. Heroism was difficult when you were being drained by creatures smaller than your fingernail. The humour, if you can call it that, is how normalised this was. A Viking would not have considered lice an unusual problem. Everyone had them, from the lowest servant to the highest-ranking chieftain. In fact, grooming tools like combs and tweezers were so common in Viking graves that historians consider them symbols of daily necessity, not luxury. Cleanliness in Viking terms meant keeping the swarm under control, not eliminating it. That was impossible. You did not ask if someone had lice. You assumed they did. The absurdity deepens when you consider that some of the very items meant to fight pests carried their own risks. Bedding stuffed with straw was cheap and available, but it also acted like a parasite nursery. Woolen clothing was warm, but lice clung to the fibres relentlessly. Even the longhouse walls of turf or timber harboured insects, giving them year-round shelter. You were living in what amounted to a multi-species hostel, and you were not the one in charge of the reservations. The effects on sleep were devastating. Scratching became as much a nightly ritual as stoking the fire. You tossed, you turned, you clawed at your scalp until your nails were dirty and broken, then you finally drifted into shallow rest, only to wake up with fresh bites. Modern studies show that bedbugs alone can reduce sleep quality by a third. Now multiply that by fleas, lice, worms and rats, and you begin to understand why the Viking Longhouse was less home and more torture chamber. There is also the small matter of disease. While the great plagues of later centuries came after the Viking Age, the pests of the Longhouse still carried their own hazards. Fleas and lice spread bacterial infections, and rats contaminated food supplies. Outbreaks of illness would sweep through settlements with ease, magnified by the fact that everyone lived and slept in one giant shared room. One person's infestation was everyone's infestation. It was democracy at its worst, a shared system of suffering with no escape clause. You scratch your arm again and wonder how people tolerated it. The answer is simple. They did not have a choice. This was life. Archaeology provides the proof in excruciating detail. Coprolites, lice combs, flea remains, rat bones, all painting the same picture. The Viking Longhouse was not only smoky, cold, and noisy. It was alive with creatures feeding on you, beside you, and above you. You roll over on the straw, but the movement only stirs more fleas into action. Rats scuttle along the rafters, chickens squawk in protest, and someone nearby mutters in their sleep while scratching furiously. You close your eyes, but the itch never leaves. This is not rest. This is a battlefield where you are the supply line and the enemy is everywhere. And if the vermin were not enough to rob you of peace, the structure of the longhouse itself made sure you never forgot just how fragile your shelter was. Because beneath the scratching and coughing, the walls and roof had their own set of problems that turned your home into a constant project of patching and repair. The scratching in your straw bed is relentless, but it is nothing compared to the groaning sound above your head. The rafters creak, a heavy thud shakes the thatch, and for a moment you're not sure if the roof will stay in place. Living in a Viking longhouse meant learning to trust a structure that seemed determined to betray you at the worst possible moment. Longhouses were impressive in scale, stretching up to 70 feet in length in some settlements, but they were not monuments of architectural perfection. They were practical, hastily built, and constantly wearing down under the strain of northern weather. Timber walls bowed outward, thatch roofs sagged under snow, and turf walls absorbed water like giant sponges until they crumbled apart. Archaeological reconstructions in Denmark and Iceland have shown that the average longhouse needed repairs every few years just to remain livable. Your home was not a fortress. It was a leaky, groaning compromise between survival and collapse. You feel a drop of water land on your forehead. It is not rain, but meltwater seeping through the thatch roof. Viking thatch was layered thickly with reeds, grass or heather, but in heavy storms it leaked like a sieve. In winter, snow piled on top, and when it melted, the water trickled directly into the living space. Families spread extra straw to soak up puddles, which only created new habitats for fleas and mould. By spring, the smell of damp rot competed with smoke for dominance, turning your longhouse into something between a barn and a swamp. Timber beams were no better. The great wooden posts that supported the roof often rotted at the base where they met the damp ground. Excavations in Norway and Sweden have uncovered post holes filled with decayed wood, evidence that supports were constantly being replaced. Imagine trying to rest at night with the knowledge that the very beam above your head might split in the next storm. The sagas talk about bravery on the battlefield, but the quieter bravery was trusting your roof not to kill you while you slept. Turf walls sound sturdy until you realise they are basically stacked chunks of soil held together by grass roots. Over time, these absorbed rain, cracked under frost, and crumbled without constant maintenance. Archaeologists studying turf structures in Iceland note that many collapsed after only a few decades, requiring rebuilding from the ground up. For a family that already spent each day farming, fishing and surviving, maintaining a house that slowly dissolved into mud was yet another endless chore. The longhouse was not a static home. It was a project that never ended, as if you were constantly paying rent to nature itself. Even the floors worked against you. Packed earth was cheap and functional, but it shifted, cracked, and absorbed whatever was spilled on it. Animal droppings, urine from chamber pots, spilled mead, and food scraps all soaked into the dirt, creating a soft, uneven surface that smelled worse with every season. Archaeological soil layers inside excavated longhouses show rich deposits of organic waste, confirming that the floor was essentially a compost heap you were expected to sleep on. Imagine dropping your dinner on the floor and realising it was gone forever, claimed by the same ground you would later step barefoot across in the dark. Fire added the greatest risk of all. That central hearth kept you alive, but it also threatened to destroy everything. A single spark landing in the dry thatch could ignite the roof in seconds. There was no fire department, no bucket brigade, only a desperate scramble to smother flames before the entire hall became an inferno. Charred remains of longhouses across Scandinavia tell the story clearly. Fire was a constant fear, and many houses simply did not survive it. You were sleeping under a roof that doubled as a tinderbox, and every cough of the fire reminded you of the risk. The absurdity of Viking architecture is that it was both ingenious and flawed. Longhouses were designed to shelter entire communities, combining humans, animals, and food under one roof for efficiency. But that efficiency came at the cost of comfort. The very features that made them practical, central fires, turf insulation, communal spaces, also made them miserable. They trapped smoke, absorbed water, attracted vermin, and demanded endless upkeep. Modern homes may creak, but rarely do they threaten collapse with every storm. You shift again on your straw bed, listening to the drip of water, the creak of beams, and the scratching of rats in the rafters. You're not sleeping in a grand hall of warriors. You're sleeping in a half-rotten barn held together by mud, timber, and desperate hope. It is shelter, yes, but shelter that constantly reminds you it could fail. And while you wrestle with the fear of the roof falling in, you realise the longhouse held yet another torment that robbed people of rest. Not just the structure or the smoke or the fleas, but the very air itself, thick with sickness and contagion that spread easily in these cramped wooden prisons. Your skin itches from fleas, your lungs sting from smoke, and the rafters groan above you. But none of those discomforts compares to the silent danger creeping through the longhouse air. The real killer here is not just the cold or the rats. It is the sickness carried on every cough, sneeze, and scratch, the diseases that spread through the longhouse like sparks leaping from the hearth. When dozens of people and animals slept in the same room, illness was inevitable. The air was thick with moisture, smoke, and germs long before anyone understood what a germ was. A single cough from a child could ripple through the household in days, infecting every relative, servant, and guest. Archaeological studies of Viking remains show evidence of tuberculosis, leprosy, and chronic respiratory damage, all conditions that thrived in cramped, smoky homes. You were not just living with your family, you were living with their colds, their fevers, and their infections, whether you wanted to or not. The smoke itself made everything worse. Without chimneys, people inhaled soot daily, leaving their lungs coated in black residue. Research on soot exposure shows it damages the immune system, making you more susceptible to illness. That means even if you survived the cold, your lungs were weakened, turning every winter cough into a potential death sentence. Imagine falling asleep next to someone hacking through the night and realizing you will be doing the same within the week. Parasites added another layer of misery. Fleas and lice did not just make you itch. They carried bacteria, spreading skin infections and other illnesses through constant biting and scratching. Worm infestations weakened bodies already battling malnutrition. Archaeologists have even found evidence of tapeworms in Viking latrines, meaning every trip outside risked more than just cold feet. You were constantly under attack, not just from the environment, but from microscopic invaders living in the very walls, straw, and bedding of the house. Leprosy, often associated with the Middle Ages, was present in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Skeletal remains show the bone damage characteristic of the disease, proving it spread long before later medieval outbreaks. Tuberculosis, carried by close human contact, has also been identified in Viking remains. These illnesses thrived because everyone shared one giant smoky room. Privacy was a luxury, and so was distance. If one person was sick, everyone else was forced into the same infectious cloud. And then there was smallpox. Genetic studies have shown that strains of smallpox existed in Europe centuries earlier than previously thought, possibly even during the Viking Age. Some scientists believe that Viking raids may have helped spread the virus across Europe. That means when you crawled into bed inside a longhouse, you were not just facing fleas or smoke. You were lying in a potential incubator for one of history's most feared diseases. The absurdity is that Vikings valued health in ways that almost mocked their environment. They bathed more frequently than many Europeans of their time, with records from chroniclers noting weekly washing rituals. They prized grooming, as combs, tweezers, and cleaning tools appear often in graves. Yet all of this meant little when the very air they breathed sabotaged their health nightly. You could scrub your hair, polish your beard, and still be coughing yourself awake with the rest of the household. Illness shaped Viking society in ways often overlooked. High child mortality meant families had to have many children just to ensure survival. Feasts and gatherings, while important culturally, also acted as super-spreader events long before anyone had the language to describe them. Imagine trying to enjoy poetry sung by a skald, while half the hall sniffled and sneezed into their ale. Warriors setting out on raids carried not just weapons, but also pathogens, spreading disease as efficiently as they spread fear. Modern studies of sleep show how critical rest is for immunity. Without deep, uninterrupted sleep, your body cannot repair or defend itself properly. But in a longhouse, sleep was a shallow, fractured thing, broken by coughing neighbours, animal noises, and the itch of parasites. That constant deprivation meant your body was never at full strength. You woke up weaker, more vulnerable, and more likely to fall ill again. It was a cycle that repeated with every season, grinding people down slowly. You pull the wool blanket tighter, listening to the hacking cough of someone 2 bodies over. Their child whimpers, their spouse stirs, and soon the sound of illness ripples through the entire row of sleepers. You can almost feel the invisible invasion in the air. This is not just discomfort. This is a war you never chose, one fought in lungs, bloodstreams, and intestines. And unlike a raid or a battle, there was no glory in surviving it. The sagas may not tell you about the sound of children wheezing or the sight of a neighbour's sores, but archaeology fills in the silence. Bones scarred with disease, soil samples rich in parasite eggs, and soot-filled rafters speak louder than the poems. The truth is unavoidable. Viking longhouses were breeding grounds for sickness, places where health was always on the edge, where each winter meant another round of illness spreading through the hall. You close your eyes, but even in shallow sleep the coughing continues. The air is thick, the straw is damp, and the sickness never stops moving from body to body. It is not just a house. It is an incubator, one that reminds you nightly that survival here was always temporary. And as if the sickness were not enough, there was another kind of torment waiting when the longhouse filled with people. The sheer lack of privacy, the complete absence of solitude, made every moment a reminder that you were never truly alone, not even in the dark. You roll onto your side, scratching at a flea bite, and realise that even in the dim glow of the fire you're being watched, not by malice, but by proximity. A child stirs 3 feet away. An elder mutters in his sleep. The goat shifts, exhaling into your blanket. There is no corner to retreat to, no curtain to draw, no door to close. Inside a Viking longhouse, privacy was not a concept. It was a fantasy. The layout itself erased solitude. Longhouses were built as single-room structures stretching anywhere from 30 to 70 feet, with the hearth in the centre and raised platforms along the walls for sleeping. That meant everyone ate, worked, talked, and slept in the same shared space. Archaeological reconstructions in Denmark and Iceland have confirmed that partitions were rare. Usually nothing more than woven screens or wooden planks, offering the illusion of separation. Even the wealthiest households lived communally. The idea of a private bedroom simply did not exist. You try to imagine whispering to someone without the entire hall overhearing. Every sound carried across the timber beams, every cough, every shuffle, every whispered word was part of the collective noise. Secrets were almost impossible. If you argued, the entire family knew. If you were sick, everyone heard it. If you attempted a quiet moment, the scratching of fleas or the bleating of livestock made sure your solitude was shared anyway. Sleeping arrangements made it worse. People sprawled on straw mattresses laid side by side, sometimes separated by low wooden dividers, but usually just pressed shoulder to shoulder. Families slept together with servants nearby, and livestock often just feet away. In this setting, your body was never your own. Someone's elbow pressed into your ribs. Someone else's child rolled across your legs. The sagas may describe warriors lying by the fire, but the truth was closer to a human pile in which personal space did not exist. Anthropologists studying communal societies note that constant exposure to others changes behaviour. In Viking longhouses, modesty was minimal because it could not be maintained. Bathing, grooming, and even relieving yourself were semi-public acts, either carried out indoors or in shared spaces outside. Archaeological finds of latrine pits close to houses confirm that even the most private acts were done within earshot of the household. Imagine trying to slip quietly out at night, only to have half the house wake up to the sound of a door creaking and footsteps crunching in the frost. Privacy did not just vanish at night. During the day, the longhouse was alive with work. Women spun wool, men repaired tools, children played, and elders told stories, all within the same cramped walls. The constant activity meant you could not step away even in daylight. The only true escape was leaving the house altogether, stepping out into freezing winds, and hoping the solitude of the landscape outweighed the risk of frostbite. Alone time meant outdoor chores, and chores were rarely relaxing. The psychological effect of this constant exposure must have been immense. Modern research shows that humans need periods of privacy to reduce stress. Without it, tension rises, conflicts increase, and mental fatigue sets in. In the Viking Longhouse, where dozens of people shared one smoky room, those stresses would have been constant. Sagas hint at this indirectly, describing quarrels, feuds, and sudden bursts of violence inside households. Living pressed together in itchy, smoky misery did not inspire patience. It bred frustration. Even social hierarchy failed to protect privacy. The chieftain may have claimed the central space by the fire, but his servants and guests still occupied the same hall. Archaeological studies of high-status farms in Norway show no evidence of separate private chambers during the Viking Age. Everyone, from leader to thrall, slept under the same rafters. You might be more respected, but you were not more alone. Your snores were still heard, your coughs still shared, and your business still everyone's business. You pull the blanket tighter, wishing for silence, but instead hear the rustle of someone scratching, the shift of animals, and the crackle of fire. The lack of privacy was more than an inconvenience. It shaped how people saw themselves. Community mattered because individuality was suffocated. Your life was defined by the group, your nights spent in constant exposure to others. Privacy was not expected, and so it was not missed, at least not in the way we crave it now. But for you, lying awake in the straw, it is claustrophobia disguised as family life. The absurdity of it all is how normalized it became. Privacy did not just fail to exist, it failed to matter. Viking households were built on the assumption that you belong to the group, not to yourself. Your rest, your space, your breath, even your silence were collective property. That might have created strong social bonds, but it also meant you never truly escaped the presence of others. You close your eyes and try to imagine one night alone, a night with no coughing neighbour, no restless child, no bleating goat. But the Longhouse never gives you that gift. It is a constant reminder that in this world, solitude is not only rare, it is impossible. And while the lack of privacy gnaws at your patience, the Longhouse had yet another trick to wear you down. The very air inside was thick not just with smoke and sickness, but also with smells so pungent they clung to your skin, turning every breath into a test of endurance. You breathe in, hoping the air will calm your nerves, and instantly regret it. The smell inside a Viking longhouse is so dense it feels chewable, a pungent stew of smoke, sweat, manure and decay that lingers in your nostrils like an unwelcome guest. Every inhale reminds you that living in this space was less about breathing and more about surviving the constant assault of odour. The hearth fire dominated the scent profile, filling the air with wood smoke that clung to clothing, bedding and skin. Without chimneys, the smoke drifted freely, coating everything in soot. Archaeological reconstructions of Viking houses have shown soot deposits up to several centimetres thick on rafters, evidence of centuries of exposure. That smoke did more than irritate lungs. It embedded itself into the very fibres of your wool blanket and tunic. No matter where you went, you carried the smell of the longhouse with you. a walking advertisement that you lived in a barn with a permanent campfire. But smoke was only the base note in this olfactory nightmare. Layered on top of it was the odour of unwashed bodies. Vikings valued grooming more than many Europeans of the time, but bathing was still limited, often weekly at best. Sweat soaked into wool clothing which rarely saw soap and water. Wool retained moisture and odours, turning every cloak into a personal fermentation vat. The combination of sweat, lanolin from the wool, and smoke produced a smell that no amount of combing could disguise. Visitors to Viking settlements often remarked on the pungency of northern life, and for good reason. You could smell the hall long before you saw it. Livestock added another unavoidable layer. Goats, sheep, and cattle shared the longhouse during winter, leaving behind manure and urine that mingled with the earthen floors. Straw scattered to absorb waste quickly grew damp, rotting into a sour stench that mixed with smoke and sweat. Archaeological soil samples from Viking sites reveal high concentrations of organic waste, confirming that these smells were not occasional accidents, but everyday reality. Imagine trying to sleep while breathing an air that carried the unmistakable scent of a barnyard in overdrive. Food contributed as well. Fish, a staple of the Viking diet, was dried, salted, or smoked, leaving behind sharp odours that clung to the air. Meat hung from rafters to cure in smoke, dripping fat onto the floor below. Dairy products such as bog butter added their own unique notes, a rich tang that was less appetizing than alarming. Combined with spilled ale, burnt porridge and unwashed dishes, the longhouse smelled perpetually like a kitchen that had not been cleaned in months. Even the walls carried their own contribution. Turf walls absorbed moisture and organic material, releasing the smell of damp earth. Timber posts, often half-rotted from contact with the ground, exhaled their own musty odour. The building itself was alive with decay, its very structure adding to the aroma. Archaeologists who have worked inside reconstructed turf longhouses note that the smell of damp soil permeates everything, leaving even modern visitors with the sense that they are trapped in a compost pile with a roof. The absurdity is that people stopped noticing. When you lived in this environment every day, your senses adjusted. What was nauseating to an outsider became normal for those inside. Chroniclers from abroad often describe the smell of Norse settlements in disgust, while local sagas made no mention of it at all. To Vikings, the smell was not remarkable, it was simply life. You smelled like smoke and sweat because everyone else did too. The entire world was a communal odour cloud. That did not mean the smells had no impact. Respiratory illnesses were aggravated by inhaling smoke mixed with animal waste. The constant dampness and rot weakened immune systems and irritated skin. Even teeth carried the evidence, as tartar deposits in Viking skeletons often hold traces of soot, proving that the smoke-laden air left its mark inside their mouths. You were not just smelling the longhouse, you were ingesting it with every breath. You roll onto your back trying to escape the sourness in the air, but the smell is inescapable. It is in your blanket, in your hair, in the straw beneath you. Even outside, the odour follows, clinging to your skin like a second shadow. Washing could dull it briefly, but by nightfall you are back in the same smoky, sweaty stew. Modern people light candles to create atmosphere. Vikings lit fires that created lung damage, and their atmosphere was the lingering perfume of smoke and manure. The comedic tragedy is that some of these smells were considered positive. Smoke preserved meat, manure fertilized fields, and sweat proved hard work. To a Viking, these were the smells of survival. To you, lying awake in a haze of smoke, rot, and sweat, it is more like an endurance trial disguised as a bedtime routine. You're not resting. You're marinating in the longhouse's signature scent. You close your eyes, but the smell never leaves. It sticks to your skin, clogs your nose, and fills your dreams with images of smoke and damp earth. The longhouse is not just a place you live. It is a place that consumes your senses, branding you with its odour until you are indistinguishable from the house itself. And while the smells were enough to ruin every night, the Longhouse had one more way to remind you of its power. Not through the air, but through the sounds of ritual, gatherings, and endless activity that often turn the supposed sanctuary of the night into a stage for chaos. You settle into the straw, desperate for silence, but the Longhouse has other plans. Tonight is not for sleeping. Tonight is for feasting, and that means the hall transforms from smoky barn to raucous arena, filling every inch of space with noise, chaos, and the kind of smells that make you question if food and animals should ever share the same room. Feasts were the beating heart of Viking social life. Archaeological digs at sites like Borg in Norway reveal massive longhouses, some stretching more than 80 feet, designed specifically to host large gatherings. Here chieftains displayed wealth, warriors boasted of raids, and poets recited sagas. These events were not optional, they were obligations, political tools disguised as celebrations. When the Longhouse filled with people, you didn't rest. You endured. The noise was overwhelming. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, crammed into the hall, voices rising over the crackling fire. Drinking horns clattered, laughter turned to shouting, and skalds attempted to project poetry over the roar. Archaeological evidence of lyres, flutes, and horns suggests music filled the air as well, though it was likely drowned by the sound of drunken arguments. Imagine trying to sleep while your neighbours argue about cattle ownership at the top of their lungs, punctuated by someone falling into the fire pit. Food amplified the chaos. Platters of meat were passed around, fish was roasted, and bread was torn apart in chunks. The sagas loved to describe overflowing tables, but the reality was messier. Grease dripped onto the floor, bones were tossed aside, and half-empty cups of ale were spilled into the straw. The earthen floor soaked it all up, ensuring the hall would smell of stale drink and rotting meat long after the party ended. You were not just sharing a room with your family, you were sharing it with a banquet's worth of leftovers fermenting in the corners. Drinking drove the night forward. Mead and ale flowed heavily, weaker than modern liquor but consumed in such volume that drunkenness was inevitable. Sagas described drinking contests, boasting matches, and sudden eruptions of violence once enough cups had been drained. Rest was impossible in a space where one person sang loudly, another vomited into a bucket, and two more wrestled in the corner. Archaeological evidence supports the heavy drinking culture, with imported drinking vessels found across Viking sites, proof that the Longhouse was as much tavern as home. The rituals themselves added to the spectacle, sacrifices to the gods, toasts to ancestors, and recitations of heroic deeds often stretched into the night. These were not quiet ceremonies. They were public performances meant to bind the community together. Skaldic poetry carved into memory and recited aloud filled the smoky air, and if you hoped to close your eyes, the cadence of verse reminded you that rest was not part of the schedule. What made it worse was that these gatherings often blurred into ordinary life. Feasts were not rare indulgences. They were regular markers of harvests, victories, alliances, or simply the need to assert status. In Icelandic sagas, leaders were judged by their ability to host grand gatherings, and those who failed to provide enough food or drink lost prestige. That meant you, lying in the corner, endured not just one night of noise, but a cycle of constant disturbances, each feast bleeding into the next. The physical toll was immense. Imagine sleeping in a hall filled with stale ale fumes, greasy smoke, and bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. If you were lucky, you found a patch of straw not soaked in spilled drink. If you were unlucky, you woke up with someone's foot in your face and the sour smell of mead in your hair. Modern science shows alcohol disrupts sleep quality, even in clean, quiet rooms. In the Viking Longhouse, the disruption was multiplied by volume, stench, and violence. Feasts also magnified health risks. Shared cups, communal platters, and crowded spaces spread illness quickly. Combined with already fragile immune systems weakened by smoke and malnutrition, these gatherings acted as disease accelerators. Archaeologists analysing latrine pits from Viking towns have found parasite eggs in abundance, proof that hygiene standards were non-existent at these parties. A feast might celebrate survival, but it also guaranteed the spread of the next round of sickness. The absurdity is that feasts were meant to unify, yet they often fractured peace. Sagas are filled with tales of feasts turning bloody, alliances collapsing over insults, and warriors waking with bruises they could not remember earning. What was billed as a night of bonding often became a theatre of chaos, with sleep the first casualty. You could survive the smoke, the fleas, and the cold, but when the Longhouse filled with revelry, you had no hope of rest. You curl into the straw, covering your head with a blanket, but it does nothing. The sound of voices, the smell of meat, the heat of the fire, and the press of bodies make the night endless. Sleep is stolen by the Longhouse again, this time not by pests or drafts, but by the weight of celebration itself. And when the feast finally ends, the aftermath begins. The floor is sticky with ale, the straw damp with spills, and the air sour with the stench of vomit and sweat. You wake to find the Longhouse not restored to order, but left in ruins until the next gathering sweeps through. And just when you think the chaos might ease, the Longhouse reveals yet another cruelty. For even if you endured the feasts, the smells, and the sickness, you still had to live under the constant presence of smoke, a substance that scarred not only lungs but also eyesight, leaving many Vikings half blind from years of inhaling their own hearth fire. The feast has ended. The last voices have gone quiet, but the smoke never leaves. It drifts upward from the hearth, curls around the rafters, and settles back down on your face as you try to breathe. It stings your eyes, burns your throat, and makes your chest feel heavy, as if you are sleeping inside the chimney of your own fire. In a sense, you are. The Viking Longhouse had no chimney, only a central fire pit dug into the floor. Smoke was meant to escape through vents in the roof or cracks in the walls, but more often it hung suspended in the air, trapped just where you needed to breathe. Archaeologists examining soot layers on timbers from Longhouse sites have found thick deposits, proof that generations of fires coated the interiors in black residue. The rafters were stained, the walls darkened, and the lungs of every person inside became unwilling smoke filters. Respiratory disease was inevitable. Soot particles inhaled daily caused chronic bronchitis, asthma-like symptoms, and long-term lung damage. Studies of skeletons from Viking settlements reveal rib lesions and spinal changes consistent with respiratory stress. You were not a warrior coughing dramatically after battle. You were a farmer coughing every morning because your home filled your lungs with wood smoke. Survival did not kill you. Breathing did. The eyes suffered just as much. Long exposure to smoke inflamed and damaged them, leading to chronic irritation, infection, and even blindness. Modern studies on people living in smoke-filled environments without ventilation show high rates of cataracts and vision loss. Now imagine decades of smoke exposure inside a longhouse, where even children grew up squinting through a haze. Archaeologists cannot measure the tears that rolled down Viking faces, but the evidence of soot and the accounts of a later chroniclers suggest households filled with people blinking through red, stinging eyes, unable to escape the invisible poison swirling inside. Even the skin bore the mark of the hearth. Constant contact with soot blackened hands, lined faces, and clung to hair. Bathing helped, but only temporarily. You could wash in a stream on Saturday, and by Sunday morning you were once again coated in ash. Viking grooming tools, from combs to ear spoons, were found in abundance because cleaning yourself was a daily necessity in a world where your house literally rubbed off on you. Yet no amount of grooming removed the burn in your lungs or the sting in your eyes. The absurdity is that smoke was both curse and tool. It preserved meat hanging from the rafters, dried fish stored for winter, and deterred some insects from swarming in the rafters. In that sense, the poison in your lungs doubled as a refrigerator. You breathed disease so that your dinner would last until spring. Archaeological finds of smoked meats confirm that preservation worked, but at the cost of human health. Every bite of preserved fish was seasoned with a lifetime of coughs. The health impact rippled through society. Children raised in smoke-filled homes grew weaker, more prone to illness, and often failed to reach adulthood. Women cooking over open hearths faced the brunt of exposure, their lungs bearing the scars of decades of smoke. Men, often away raiding, may have escaped some of the worst nights, but returned to houses that smothered them just the same. The Longhouse was a slow killer, not in battle, but in the simple act of living within its walls. Modern researchers studying indoor air pollution often use Viking-style houses as case studies. Reconstructions show carbon monoxide levels that would horrify any modern safety inspector. Longhouse fires, especially in winter when doors and vents stayed closed, created toxic concentrations of gases. That means the glowing warmth you huddled around each night was not just keeping you alive, it was slowly suffocating you with invisible fumes. You could not see carbon monoxide, but you felt its work in the morning dizziness, headaches, and exhaustion. You thought you were just tired from chores. In truth, you were being poisoned by your own fire. Your body never forgot it. Chronic coughing shaped Viking voices, leaving throats rough and raw. Wheezing became the soundtrack of households, described indirectly in sagas that mention sickness, but never the cause. Archaeological evidence fills the silence, pointing again and again to soot and smoke as the hidden torment of daily life. People died younger not only because of raids or hunger, but because their lungs collapsed under the weight of their own hearths. You close your eyes, but sleep offers no escape. You dream in smoke, breathe in smoke, wake in smoke. The Longhouse brands you with its haze, leaving you weak-eyed, hoarse, and short of breath. This is not a home. It is a furnace that cooks you slowly while pretending to keep you safe. And even when the fire dies down, the danger remains. The air thickens, the rafters drip with soot, and the straw beneath you reeks of smoke mixed with sweat. The Longhouse is not content with robbing your rest. It insists on leaving you scarred, coughing, and stumbling half-blind into the next day. And as you grope for air in the suffocating dark, you realise that the Longhouse tormented not only bodies, but also minds. For even in the haze, surrounded by noise and filth, you are expected to endure the constant weight of superstition, omens and rituals that turned the Longhouse into a place of unease as well as survival. The smoke has dulled your eyes and the coughing has worn your throat raw, but now it is your mind that begins to betray you. As the fire burns low, shadows dance on the rafters, and every sound seems to whisper something more than wood creaking or rats scuttling. In a Viking Longhouse, the night was never just night. It was a stage where superstition came alive, filling the dark with unseen watchers. The sagas record a world where spirits, gods, and ancestors were ever present. Inside the Longhouse, that belief pressed against every wall. The fire was not just warmth, it was sacred, tied to the goddess of the hearth, and letting it die out invited bad fortune. You slept knowing someone was always awake to tend it, not out of kindness, but out of fear that neglecting the fire would draw divine wrath. Archaeological evidence of carefully maintained hearths, with layers of ash preserved across centuries, confirms that this fear was constant. The fire was your lifeline and your prison. The dead were never far away. Ancestors were believed to linger, watching the living and sometimes demanding offerings. Burial mounds close to Longhouse sites show how intimately the dead were tied to daily life. You might step outside to relieve yourself only to do so beside the graves of relatives who are thought to influence the luck of the household. At night, lying awake in the Longhouse, you did not just listen to coughs and bleats. You listened for whispers of ancestors you feared might not be resting. Then there were the Draugr, the restless dead. These revenants haunted Norse imagination, rising from graves to torment the living. The sagas are filled with accounts of Draugr stalking houses, spreading disease or crushing sleepers. Even if only a fraction of people believed it fully, the thought lingered in the dark. Every groan of timber or thump from the rafters became a possible sign that something beyond human had entered the hall. In a house already alive with rats and fleas, it was not hard to imagine more sinister intruders. Animals themselves were loaded with meaning. A howling dog outside could signal death. A crow at the roof was an omen of Odin's attention, not always welcome. Even dreams were suspect. In Norse belief, dreams could carry prophetic visions, messages from gods or spirits. Sleeping in a longhouse was not just restless. It was a nightly gamble that whatever fragment of dream you managed would be read as a sign of fortune or disaster. Archaeologists have uncovered ritual deposits beneath Viking houses, animal bones, tools, even human remains, placed deliberately as offerings for protection. That means when you lay your head down at night, the very ground beneath you might contain sacrifices meant to ward off evil. Did it comfort you to know your house was built on buried bones, or did it make the night heavier, reminding you that protection was always fragile? The evidence suggests people lived with that tension daily, convinced the unseen world was just as crowded as the visible one. The absurdity is that superstition filled the gaps where misery already thrived. Smoke damaged your lungs, fleas drained your blood, cold froze your bones, and then fear whispered that a ghost might press down on your chest before dawn. You were never simply uncomfortable. You were uncomfortable and convinced the discomfort carried meaning. The longhouse was both shelter and shrine, a place where survival and belief collided under the same dripping roof. Social rituals reinforced the unease. Feasts included toasts to gods, not just for prosperity, but for protection against bad luck. Sacrifices of animals, sometimes even humans according to controversial accounts from chroniclers like Ibn Fadlan, were tied to ensuring that the community survived another winter. Imagine trying to fall asleep after a ritual sacrifice, the smell of blood lingering in the air, and the belief that the gods were still watching from the rafters. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories reveal the atmosphere of unease that hung over every longhouse gathering. Even the architecture played into fear. The long, narrow design funneled sound, making whispers seem louder, and footsteps echo unnaturally. Archaeologists experimenting with reconstructed halls have noted how acoustics magnify even small noises. To a Viking lying awake in the dark, the hall was alive with amplified creaks, hisses, and murmurs. You were not imagining voices. The house itself made them. You close your eyes, but sleep brings no comfort. Every dream might be a message. Every noise might be an omen. Every shadow might be a draugar. The longhouse strips you of solitude and then fills the emptiness with spirits, ancestors, and gods who demand attention. Even in rest, you are never alone. And just as the weight of superstition presses down on your chest, the longhouse adds yet another trial. Not only were nights haunted by unseen forces, but they were also interrupted by the brutal demands of daily work. Because even when you were meant to rest, chores never stopped, and the longhouse was always alive with the grind of survival. The shadows still flicker on the rafters, but even as the last whispers of superstition settle, the longhouse stirs again. Not with feasts or rituals this time, but with the scrape of tools, the clatter of pots, and the steady hum of work that never seemed to end. The longhouse was not just a place for eating and sleeping. It was the factory floor, workshop, and kitchen of Viking life, and that meant quiet was never an option. Textiles were the heartbeat of the hall. Women spun wool into yarn and wove it into cloth using massive upright looms that stood against the walls. Archaeologists have uncovered loom weights in almost every major Viking settlement, proof of just how constant this work was. The sound of the loom was a nightly companion, the clack of wood and the swish of thread echoing across the smoky air. Wool was not optional. It was survival, clothing families, making sails for ships, and producing goods for trade. That meant every free moment, even at night, was often filled with spinning, weaving, and mending. You might close your eyes, but the steady rhythm of the loom made sure you were never far from the reality that survival depended on endless labour. Food preparation was equally consuming. Grains had to be ground into flour using heavy quern stones, a task so backbreaking that archaeologists studying skeletal remains of Viking women often find spinal damage and joint stress directly linked to grinding grain. Imagine trying to sleep while someone just a few feet away pushed a heavy stone back and forth, hour after hour, producing the coarse flour that would become tomorrow's gritty bread. The sagas may describe heroes feasting, but the real story was the sound of grinding stones in the background of every night. Animal care was another source of endless disruption. Livestock inside the longhouse needed constant attention. Milking had to be done, stalls cleaned, and animals fed. Even in the middle of the night, a restless cow or bleating goat could rouse the household into activity. Archaeological studies of animal bones at Viking farmsteads confirm how essential livestock were, but also how much work they created. You were not simply living beside them, you were living in service to them, every sound a reminder of chores waiting to be done. The absurdity of the longhouse was that its very design ensured chores invaded every corner of life. The central fire meant cooking was always in the middle of the room, with pots simmering, meat roasting, and smoke drifting into every bed of straw. Food could not simply be prepared and forgotten. It had to be stirred, tended, and guarded against scavenging animals. That meant someone was always working at the hearth, stirring porridge or checking fish, even as others tried to sleep. Repairs filled in whatever time was left. Timber walls shifted and cracked. Turf needed patching, and tools broke constantly. The longhouse was a living structure, and without steady maintenance it would collapse. Archaeological evidence shows frequent rebuilding, with posts replaced and roofs repaired at short intervals. That meant hammering, sawing, and patching were as much a part of life as breathing smoke. The sound of someone hammering a new peg into place could interrupt your night as easily as a cough or a bleat. Even light chores made rest impossible. Children fetched water or straw, elders prepared herbs for medicine, and servants tended to clothing or equipment. There was no division between day and night when survival dictated constant vigilance. In modern life, chores wait for morning. In a longhouse, chores were always immediate, because leaving them meant risking food spoiling, animals suffering, or tools failing. The entire household worked on a rhythm of necessity, not comfort. The archaeological record paints the picture clearly. Loom weights, spindle whorls, quern stones, and cooking pots appear in abundance, testifying to the constant churn of work inside the hall. Even graves sometimes contain these tools, suggesting that people identified so strongly with their labour that it followed them into death. Work was not an interruption to life in the longhouse, it was the essence of it. You roll over on the straw, but instead of silence you hear the swish of a loom, the scrape of a stone, and the snort of livestock. Rest is not part of the equation here. The longhouse never sleeps because survival never pauses. Every creak of timber and flicker of flame is accompanied by the reminder that work is waiting, and if it is not done, the hall itself could collapse into hunger or ruin. And yet, even through all the noise of chores, there is another constant reminder of discomfort. Not just the labour, but the very clothing on your back, heavy wool that itched, stank, and never truly kept the cold away, wrapping you in discomfort long after the loom fell silent. The loom falls silent for a moment, but your body is still restless. Not from the noise now, but from the very clothing clinging to your skin. Wool itches at your neck, your blanket smells like goat, and the hide beneath you still carries the greasy memory of the animal it once was. The longhouse never let you rest, not even in what you wore or what you slept on. Wool was the foundation of Viking clothing. Sheep provided endless supply, and spinning, dyeing, and weaving, it was one of the most labour-intensive tasks of the age. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia have turned up spindle whorls and loom weights in staggering numbers, proving textiles dominated daily life. But for all that work, the result was rarely comfortable. Viking wool retained much of its natural lanolin, a waxy grease that repelled water but clung to odours. Your tunic kept you warm in the rain, but it also smelled permanently of smoke, sweat and sheep. You did not wear clothing so much as marinate in it. Wool also scratched constantly. Without modern softening techniques, garments were coarse, heavy, and rough on skin. Imagine wearing a sweater designed to exfoliate you every second of the day. You did not stop itching. You simply grew accustomed to scratching until your skin grew raw. Viking combs might keep your hair neat, but no tool existed to make your tunic less like sandpaper. Bedding was no better. Straw mattresses were cheap and easy to replace, but they collapsed quickly, leaving lumps that poked your back and sides. Archaeological evidence from preserved farmhouses in Norway shows bedding stuffed with layers of straw and sometimes seaweed, both of which rotted into mould if not changed regularly. That meant your bed smelled faintly of decay, crawled with fleas, and felt like lying on a barn floor disguised as furniture. You were not sleeping on comfort, you were sleeping on compost. Furs offered some relief, but not much. Hides from reindeer, goats or cattle were used as blankets or covers, but they came with their own curses. Unless carefully scraped and dried, furs retained oils that grew rancid. Even well-prepared furs trapped odours of smoke and sweat, and once wet they froze stiff. Archaeologists have recovered fur bedding from graves, confirming its common use, but they also found evidence of wear that suggests constant replacement. A fur blanket kept you alive, but it also ensured you smelled like the animal it came from long after it was gone. Clothing layers only added to the discomfort. Vikings wore wool tunics, trousers, cloaks, and sometimes linen undergarments if they were lucky enough to afford imported flax. Linen was softer, but rare, meaning most people itched their way through winter wrapped in wool. Cloaks fastened with brooches offered warmth but dragged through dirt and smoke, collecting stains that never fully washed out. Archaeological textiles show discoloration from sweat, soot and soil, painting a vivid picture of garments that were less fashion and more survival gear. Washing was limited. Weekly bathing in hot springs or rivers was admired by outsiders. Even English chroniclers noted Vikings bathed more often than Anglo-Saxons. But clothing itself was rarely washed thoroughly. Wool shrinks in water and was difficult to clean without damaging it. Instead, garments were aired out, brushed or beaten, which removed some dirt but left the deeper smells intact. That meant your cloak carried months of smoke, your tunic clung to sweat, and your bedding carried the odour of every spill, sneeze and cough it had absorbed. The absurdity is that clothing was also a sign of status. Brightly dyed garments marked wealth, with reds, blues and yellows reserved for those who could afford imported dyes. Archaeological finds show traces of madder, woad and weld, plants used to create vibrant colours. Yet no matter how fine the dye, the fabric beneath was still coarse wool, and the smell of smoke and sweat clung equally to noble and thrall alike. You could strut in scarlet, but you still itched like everyone else. Even jewellery could not save you. Brooches, beads and buckles decorated clothing, but they also weighed it down, making heavy garments even heavier. At night, you removed what you could, but the wool stayed with you, scratching and pressing until you drifted into shallow, uncomfortable sleep. Archaeological finds of elaborate brooches in graves may look glamorous in museums, but in life they were just shiny anchors on clothing that already felt like a burden. You turn in your straw bed, adjusting your cloak, but the itch follows. Your blanket reeks of smoke, your tunic scratches your arms, and your fur cover smells faintly of wet goat. There is no escape, not in clothing, not in bedding, not in the air itself. The Longhouse robs you of comfort at every level, wrapping you in garments that serve as armour against the cold but torture against the skin. Modern people dream of crawling under fresh sheets or slipping into soft pyjamas. A Viking dreamed of not scratching through the night. Comfort was measured not in softness, but in whether your blanket was dry, your straw was fresh, and your tunic did not tear in the middle of a chore. Sleep was not luxury. It was compromise. You close your eyes, still itching, still choking faintly on the smell of wool and smoke, and realise that even your clothing, meant to protect you, is just another instrument of discomfort. The Longhouse has claimed your lungs, your ears, your stomach, and now even your skin. And while you shift in your itchy cloak, you are reminded that the misery of the Longhouse was not contained within its walls. The very insects, rodents, and diseases fostered inside often spread outward into the world, hitching rides on clothing, bedding, and bodies, turning the Viking household into a mobile engine of infestation. And that, my friends, is yet another reminder that history was basically one long endurance test in discomfort. If you enjoyed this little stroll through the itchy, smoky nightmare of the past, let me know in the comments what historical misery you want to hear about next. Maybe Victorian outhouse ghosts, maybe ancient Roman pets, or maybe something even worse. If you love falling asleep to tales of human suffering through the ages, make sure to check out my other videos. There's a whole catalogue of historical misery waiting for you, like a buffet of discomfort that somehow makes the perfect bedtime snack. Now go ahead, like, subscribe, and drop your vote below. I'll be here digging through the archives of human regret for our next bedtime story.